The third anchor walked out of the rock while my full weight was still on it. I felt it go through the line the way you feel a tooth loosen, a wrongness with no sound attached, and I froze against the wall of the sheer with 400 meters of mourning under my boots and called up the only word our doctrine allows a climber to call: slack, not help, never help. Help is a word for worlds where falling is an accident. On Mur, on the wall of the sheer, falling is a tribute, and you do not beg the mountain to refuse it. Seth took my weight from above without a word. I heard his harness creak, heard the chant keeper hiss 2 stations up, and I got my handspikes back into the seam and breathed until the gray cleared from the edges of my eyes. Below me, the canyon went down and down through bands of rust and bone-white stone until the morning haze swallowed it. 3 generations of my clan lay somewhere at the bottom of that haze, along with the ship that carried our names. I should tell you what we were, because there is no one left who tells it the old way, and the old way is the point of this account. I am Vekarun of the Vethkari Ridge clans, born to the climb caste, plate-bound at 6, line sworn at 10. My people are wall people. We are heavy where the wall wants weight, and horned where the wall wants stubbornness, and our gray hide takes the son of Mur the way iron takes a forge, slowly and then permanently. The catalog rates our world class 9, restricted, and the assessors who gave it that number did so from orbit, which is the only place on Mur where nothing is trying to remove you. The sheer is the wound in the middle of our continent. 4,000 meters of vertical stone, cut by a river that died before my species learned fire. When the carrier of names went down, the clan ark, the reliquary ship, the iron hull that held every honor plate ever etched since the Vethkari first roped 2 climbers together. It did not crash on the plateau where we could reach it. It went into the sheer, into the haze. 8 expeditions had gone down after it. 8 expeditions had come back lighter than they descended, and the doctrine had been chanted over every climber the wall took, and the plates were still down there, and the clans were still, in the oldest sense of our word, nameless. We were the 9th, 11 climbers of the caste. Climb master Dren Kavesh leading, his horn crest filed flat in mourning for his brother, whom the 2nd expedition had cut loose 40 years before. Thesavon keeping the chance. Seth on rope 2nd. 7 others whose names I will give when this account needs them. And the human. I want to be honest about how we treated him, because honesty is the only repayment I have left to make. We treated him like a winch, like a thing with a load rating. His name on the contract was Imran Kadi, and Dren Kavesh never once used it. He said the human. He said the porter. On the 3rd day, he said the meat that signs its name, and the rope line laughed, and I laughed with it. And I want that written down too. We had hired him at the orbital transfer station because the math demanded it. The descent route to the carrier of names required supply caches at 4 elevations, and the loads ran heavier than caste doctrine permits a sworn climber to carry. Carrying past your rating is vanity, and vanity feeds the wall. So the expedition factor had gone looking for a species with a higher rating. He came back with a Deathworlder, and the clans nearly voted the whole descent down rather than rope one in. You have heard the stories the way I had heard them, that their world is a catalog horror, that they are born into gravity that would crack our joints in weather, that kills by temperature in both directions, that the catalog lists their biosphere as predatory at all trophic levels, which is assessor language for everything there eats, and nothing there is finished evolving. I had heard all of it and believed none of it, because the creature that walked off the shuttle was smaller than our adolescents, flat-faced, blunt-horned. No horns at all, in truth, with a folded frame and quiet dark eyes and gray coming into the fur of his jaw. He carried his own contract papers in a chest pocket. I saw them once, at the weighing. Under homeworld hazard rating, the line read, Catalog Class 14, Surface Survey Prohibited. And under that, in the assessor's dry hand, native species exempt from prohibition, reason native. I thought it was a clerical joke. I was 22 years old and line sworn, and I thought a great many things were jokes. At the weighing, Drenkavesh loaded him with deliberate insult. 3 caches worth, 190 units, where my own rated load was 60, and I was the strongest of the young rope. The human looked at the scale, looked at the climb master, and asked one question. Is there more? Drenkavesh's crest flushed dark. He added the spare line drums, 20 units of dead iron, daring him. The human shrugged the frame onto his back, settled it with a small motion like a beast shaking off rein, and walked to the staging ledge to wait. He did not perform the wait. That was the first thing I could not make sense of. Any climber of the caste, loaded past rating, would let the rope line see the cost. It is honest to show the wall's price. The human carried 110 units over my rating and stood at the edge of the sheer with his thumbs hooked in the straps, looking down into the haze the way a farmer looks at weather. Sefmadun said, Lo, it doesn't know enough to fear the wound. Thesavon said, It will learn or it will feed the dark. Either way, it is paid. I said nothing because I was watching the human's boots. He had placed them, without looking, on the only 2 knuckles of rock on that ledge that were not rotten. I had grown up on that stone. It had taken me 10 years to read it. He had read it through his soles, in the time it took to walk 11 steps, on a world he had been breathing for 2 days. I should have understood then. None of us understood anything then. We went over the edge on the morning the stillwings rose, which the chant keeper called favorable, and for 6 days the descent ran clean. I will not waste this account on clean climbing. Doctrine, route, anchor, cache. The wall takes nothing it is not owed. What matters is the doctrine itself, because you will not understand what was done to me, or what was done after, which is the reason I am speaking, unless you understand the doctrine of the line. It is the oldest law the Vethkari have. Older than the clans, the chants say. It goes, what falls is given. Cut clean, chant true, climb on. A climber who falls and cannot climb is dead, not dying. Dead in law, from the moment the rope takes his hanging weight and the climb master judges he cannot recover. The line is cut by the leader's own hand, with the seveth, the hooked right knife, every sworn climber carries and prays never to draw. The chant keeper sings the giving while the blade works. The fallen one's name is etched that night on a plate, and the plate goes into the clan iron and the climb goes on. No recovery. No descent after the body. The wall has been paid, and what the wall is paid, the wall keeps. You will want to call it cruelty. I ask you to be slower than that. On a Class 9 world on 4,000 meters of rotten vertical stone, a rescue is 2 more names on the plate. The doctrine is not hatred of the fallen. The doctrine is arithmetic that learned to sing. Every climber of the caste hangs his own savate on his own chest and accepts, at 10 years old, that the blade may someday be drawn for him, and that when it is drawn, the cut is mercy, and the chant is love. I plate-bound, line-sworn. I believed it the way I believed in stone. On the 7th day at the elevation the route maps called the gray banding, the wall stopped being stone and became argument. Rust-colored plates of rock laid like shed scales, every one of them load-bearing until it wasn't. Drenkavesh slowed the rope to a crawl. The human unroped doctrine forbids a contract carrier a place on the sworn line climb parallel to us. On holds I would not have trusted with a coil of rope, the full cash load on his back, and made it look like walking downstairs in the dark. Careful, unhurried, and somehow never wrong. Cor Aleth above me muttered that the porter was shaming the line. Thessavan answered that a winch cannot shame a climber. The human, who was close enough to hear, said nothing at all. I caught his eye once across 4 meters of bad rock. He nodded the way our quarry masters nod at a wall they are about to take apart, and went back to his holds. The shelf that took me gave no warning I can put into words. I have replayed it 10,000 times. I had 3 points set, I had my weight low. I did everything the doctrine and my decade on stone demanded, and the gray banding simply decided, in the way of old rock, that it was finished holding the shape of a ledge. A plate the size of a sleeping mat sheared off under my anchor foot. My hand spikes ripped through scale rock that came away like bark. I remember the haze swinging up to where the sky should have been, and the rope shrieking through the keeper ring, and the wall hitting me. Once, twice, a third time that turned the world white, and then the line caught, and I was hanging in the open air of the sheer with the canyon's breath rising. Cold around me, 400 meters above the next ledge, and 2,000 above the haze, spinning slowly at the end of 40 meters of rope. My right leg was wrong. I knew it before the pain arrived. I could see the wrongness through the plate greaves. The shin bowed where no joint lives. The foot pointing at a horizon it had no business pointing at. The pain came a breath later, white and total, and I bit through the strap of my chin guard, keeping the scream behind my teeth, because a climber who screams on the line is already chanting his own giving. Above me, very far away, I heard Drenkavish call the rope to anchor. I heard 11 sets of spikes as bite stone. I heard the wind and the river of air that lives in the sheer and never stops moving. And under all of it, I heard the sound I had been sworn at 10 years old to hear without fear. I heard the chant keeper begin to clear her throat. Doctrine gives the hanging climber one task, the proving. If you can regain the wall under your own strength before the climb master finishes his judgment, you are alive in law. I tried. I want my clan to know I tried. I got one hand spike into the seam and pulled, and the leg swung against the stone, and the white came up over me like water over a stone. And when it receded, I was hanging again, lower in the harness, and my spike was somewhere in the haze below, falling toward my ancestors. Dren Kavesh's voice came down the wall, flattened by wind. It was not cruel. I need that understood. It was the voice of a man performing the oldest duty of his rank, and it shook only once. Vekarun, of the line of Arun, the wall has taken your leg and the rope holds your weight. Speak if you can climb. I spoke. I said I could climb. The words came out broken in half, and we both heard the lie in them, and the wind carried the lie up to him and to every climber anchored on that. rotten gray stone, and the lie was my last gift to the doctrine, because the doctrine requires the fallen to lie and the master to hear it. The line is owed, he said. What falls is given, and Thessa Von began the giving. I had sung it 11 times in my life for other climbers. I will not write the words. They are clan iron and not for outsiders. But I will tell you what it is like to hear it from underneath. It is like being lowered into your own grave by people who love you and have stopped looking at you at the same moment. The chant has a line in it about the fallen one's hands. The work of the hands outlives the hands, and I hung there in the cold, rising breath of the sheer with my legs screaming and listened to 11 voices I had known since birth take up the verse. And I looked up the rope, 40 meters, to the small, bright figure of the climb master leaning out from his anchor with the civet in his fist. The blade of a civet is hooked like a stillwing's claw, and the inner edge is honed before every climb by its owner's own hand. That is part of the rite. The blade that cuts you has been cared for. It does not saw. It gathers the line into its curve and parts it in one drawn stroke, and the chant keeper times the last verse, so the song and the rope end together. I did not look away. The fallen are permitted to close their eyes, and most do. I watched. Some stubbornness older than doctrine made me watch, made me memorize the exact shape of Drenkavesh's arm as it moved, the flat-filed crest of him dark against the morning sky of my world. He cut clean. I will give him that until my last plate is etched. He cut clean, and the chant ended on the falling note, and the wall let go of me, and I went down into the sheer with my clan's love ringing off the stone above me. What saved my life was the thing the route maps called the apron, a slope of scale rock scree flaring out from the wall 390 meters below, the debris fan of the same rotten banding that had killed me. I do not remember choosing to do anything. The caste trains falling the way it trains knots, drills it into the body below the level of thought, and the body I had spent 22 years building turned in the air, took the first impact on the pack frame, and rode the scree instead of meeting it. I remember sound more than pain, a long roar of sliding plate rock, the frame shattering, my horn crest snapping against something that did not move, and then I remember stillness and dust settling on my open eyes, and the high thin line of the sky very far above between the canyon walls, with 11 small figures on the gray banding already moving again. Climbing on, as doctrine required, I lay on the apron through the rest of that day. I will spare this account most of it. The leg was worse than broken, the greave had become part of the wound, and my left arm answered only from the elbow down, and somewhere under my backplates a rib had gone into territory ribs do not visit. I could not stand. I established that with great care twice, and the second attempt cost me a stretch of time I cannot account for at all. Understand what I knew, as a son of the doctrine. I was dead. Not despairing, dead in law. My name was being etched that night at the wall camp above. No Vethkari would descend for me. Descent after the fallen is the deepest profanation the caste recognizes, because it tells the wall its payment was not honest. My water was the half-flask on my harness. My rations had gone wherever the pack had gone. The shear's night cold kills the unsheltered even of my people. And the things that live in the scree of the apron come out when the stone cools, and they specialize, as everything on Mer specializes, in exactly my situation. I made my peace in the formal way. I sang my own closing verse quietly, because the rib made deep breath expensive, and I composed my hearts, and I watched the band of sky go from white to bronze to the deep red of Mer's evening, and I waited for my world to finish me with whatever instrument it preferred. Instead, an hour into full dark, high on the black face of the sheer, a single point of light detached itself from the wall camp and began to come down. I watched it without understanding. No Vethkari lamp burns that color, a flat white, steady, small. It moved wrong for a falling thing. It moved wrong for a climbing thing, too. Too fast, too constant, no pauses at anchor stances, descending the gray banding, the rotten scale rock that had just killed a line-sworn climber in, full daylight, in the dark, alone, at the pace of a man walking downstairs in his own house. I decided it was the death dream. The caste speaks of it. The wall sends the dying a light. I lay in the freezing scree and watched my death dream descend 400 meters of murderer's rock, and somewhere in that watching I began to hear it, boots and scree, a steady, unhurried crunch, the click of metal finding placements, and death dreams, the chants agree, make no sound. The light reached the apron. It swung across the debris fan in long flat arcs, patient as a survey instrument. Twice it passed over me, and I tried to call and made only a hiss. My voice had gone with the day's heat. The third pass caught the wreck of my pack frame, tracked the gouge my body had plowed through the scree, and followed it 60 meters to its conclusion. The lamp lowered. Behind it, in its backwash, I saw the flat, blunt face of the human, gray jaw for dusted red with scale rock powder, dark eyes moving over me with the exact expression he had given the staging ledge on the first morning, reading load paths. Doing arithmetic, he crouched and got the flask off his own harness and held it to my mouth, and while I drank, he said, in trade tongue, the first full sentence he had spoken since the weighing. Sorry about the wait. I had to let them get to sleep, or they'd have wasted rope trying to stop me. I got my voice partway back. The first thing I said to the man who had come down 1.5 kilometers of the sheer in the dark for me was doctrine. I am not proud of it, but it is true, and this account is for truth. I said, I am dead, the line was cut, you profane the wall. The human considered that the way he considered rock. Then he reached over, took my right hand, and pressed it flat against the side of my own throat, where the great vessel of my people runs shallow under the hide, and held it there until I had felt, against my own fingers, 10 slow strokes of my forward heart. Funny kind of dead, he said. Drink the rest. We'll argue law when you're not in shock. I want to record what he did that night in order, because the order is the thing I have spent 30 years failing to make my own people understand. He did not weep over me, as the rescue tales of softer worlds would have it. He did not rage at the doctrine or curse the climb master's name. He inventoried me. Hands first, he found the dead arm and bound it before I had finished explaining it. Then the ribline, with 2 flat fingers walking my back plates until I hissed. Then the leg by lamplight for a long, silent minute. Grieves in the wound, he said. It stays in until we're somewhere I can flush what's under it. You won't like the splint. There is no wood on the apron, I said. The shear grows nothing. Every expedition learns it. He was already unbuckling the long side battens from the ruin of my own pack frame. He measured them against my shins by eye, cut padding from the frame's shoulder strap with one stroke of a flat, dull gray work knife, not a right blade, not a soldier's blade, a tool, and built in roughly the time the giving takes to sing, the splint that the healers at Deathworlder would later refuse to believe had been improvised in the dark by an off-worlder, because it followed almost exactly the pattern our own bone setters teach. You have set legs before, I said, not your kind. He drew the lashings tight in 3 places at once, somehow with 2 hands. Your kind is sensible. The bone wants to be where the bone was. Most things are like that, once you find where they were. The pain of the setting took my account of the next stretch of time. When I returned, there was heat against my back plates. He had built a fire from frame scraps and a brick of something from his own kit that burned low and blue and patient. And over the small light he was doing the thing I would watch him do every night after. Going through his supplies with both hands, repacking, counting, his mouth moving slightly, rationing, arithmetic again. 190 units of caste supplies were cached on the wall above us, and he had come down with what one man could carry alone in the dark, and he was dividing it, I understood much later, by 2 lives in an unknown number of days. The expedition descends the Vethic Stair, I said, southward. The route bends away from the apron. No one will pass here. You have killed yourself, Porter. The doctrine is arithmetic, he said, not looking up. I read your doctrine before I signed. It's not wrong, for what you can carry and what your rock does. It's just done in your numbers. He cinched the pack closed and looked at me across the blue fire, and his eyes in that light were the calmest thing I had ever seen on my world, which has very little calm in it. I run different numbers. Sleep. We move at first light. Move where? I said. The wall is doctrine to climb in death to you alone. Up is 11 climbers who chanted me dead. Not up, he said, and tilted his blunt chin at the long darkness below the apron, where the sheer goes down through the haze to the place that had eaten 8 expeditions and 3 generations of my clan's names. Down. We're closer to the bottom than the top. Your ship has a hull, and a hull is shelter, water catchment, and a beacon. He lay back against his pack with his boots to the fire, and was asleep between one breath and the next, the way only soldiers and stones sleep. I lay broken on the scree of my own grave and looked at the small alien shape that the wall had not been able to keep awake, let alone kill, and for the first time in my line-sworn life, I thought a thought with no chant attached to it. What manner of world, I thought, teaches a creature to do its mourning with arithmetic and to count a stranger into the ration? I learned afterward from Sefmadun what the morning looked like from above, and this account needs it, so I set it here in its place. At first light, the wall camp found the human's anchor, his own contract line, paid out full length down the gray banding. Lashed off to a bolt, he had placed himself in the night. In rock, the route maps marked unanchorable. Beside the bolt, weighted with a stone, were his cache manifests, every load accounted for, every cache position logged in neat trade script, the work signed off complete like a shift ending. He had finished the job before he went down. Seth Madun told me Drenkavesh stood over those manifests for a long time. Then the climb master did what doctrine gave him. He declared the porter dead in law, fallen by his own hand, which is the phrase the caste uses for the unroped, struck his contract, and ordered the line south to the Vethic Stair. Thessavan asked carefully whether the giving should be sung for a contract carrier. Drenkavesh said the wall did not want him, and the rope line laughed. And Seth Madun told me 30 years later that the laugh had been thinner than the morning air, because every climber on that anchor had looked down the human's line, down the rotten banding he had descended alone in the dark, and felt the doctrine shift very slightly under their spikes, like a plate of scale rock deciding whether it was finished being a ledge. On the apron, in that same first light, the human built the rig. He had salvaged my pack frame in the night while I slept. I had heard nothing, and he rebuilt it. Against his own, frame lashed to frame into a thing our healers carry between two bearers. He meant to carry it alone. He set me into it with the splinted leg ruled straight along a batten, my dead arm bound across my chest, my weight high on his back, and when he stood, taking onto his small flat-faced frame a son of the climb caste in full plate who outweighed him twice over, I heard his breath change, one short hard exhale, the kind our quarry masters make lifting a cornerstone, and then nothing further, no groan, no performance. The cost went somewhere inside him and was filed. "Call the rocks," he said. "You know this, fan. I don't. You're the eyes. I'm the legs. That's the whole arrangement. That was the arrangement. I want it recorded because of what it did inside me, which the healers of the mind would later have a name for, but which I experienced that morning only as confusion. The doctrine had made me a corpse, and the Deathworlder had made me crew. We went down the apron with me calling the plates. Livestone, deadstone, the hollow ring of scale rock over void, and him placing his boots where I called, never twice on one plate, reading the slide paths through his soles between my words. Twice the fan moved under us. Both times he was already elsewhere. Weight transferred before the slide committed, so that the screes seemed to be lunging at a place he had merely considered standing. By the second time I understood, I was watching the thing the catalog assessors had tried to put into words from orbit. His world had not taught him to be strong, or not only that. It had taught him that the ground itself is an opponent with habits, and habits can be read. "Your homeworld," I said, somewhere in that long descending morning. "The rating is true? Class 14? "The rating's an average," he said between placements. "Some of it's worse." "Worse how?" He was quiet long enough that I thought the question had died. "Then we have walls like this, bigger some of them. Weather comes over them in winter that freezes the eyes. People climb them anyway, always have, first with hemp rope and iron nails, before we could so much as fly. A plate rang hollow. He stepped around its whole neighborhood without breaking rhythm. I did mountain recovery. Back home, 11 years. The wall where I worked killed more people every year than your shear has taken in a generation. We went up after every one of them, alive or dead. After the dead, I could not keep the profanation out of my voice. Why? What does the mountain accept in their place? Nothing, he said. The mountain's not owed. The mountain's not anything. It's rock. He found the next stance, breathed, moved. We bring them down because they're ours. That's the whole doctrine. It fits on a knife, same as yours. I lay strapped to the back of a creature from a world worse than mine and looked at the haze below, where 3 generations of my unrecovered ancestors lay with their names unspoken, and I said nothing for a long time, because the only things I could think of to say were heresies. The water's crisis at midday, as water does on Myrrh. His flask and my half-flask had gone into one ration, and the ration said 2 days, and the route down from the apron's foot said 4. He did not announce a crisis. He changed course 40 degrees toward the canyon wall without explanation, set me down in the hard shade of an overhang, and stood very still with his eyes shut, and I thought, watching him sway slightly, that the weight had finally arrived to collect. Then I understood he was listening. "There's water moving under here," he said. "Behind the wall or under the fan. Faint. Your hearing runs deeper than mine, find it. My hearing runs deeper than his." He had been on Myrrh 9 days, and he had already sorted our senses into a toolkit. I pressed my unbroken ear to the cold stone and found it at once, now that something had told me to seek it. The thread-thin voice of a seep down into the south, where the apron's plates lapped against true wall. We dug for an hour where I called it, him moving plate rock that 2 of my caste would have rigged a lever for, and the seep, when we broke through to it, filled a flask in the time a chant takes. Slow, alive, enough. He drank last. I noted it. I was beginning by then to note everything. The way you note the habits of a thing you will be asked to give testimony on. Because some part of me had already understood that I would spend the rest of my life giving testimony on him. In the late afternoon, the shear introduced him to the glasshounds. I heard them before he did. That much was still mine, the dry singing the pack makes through its shell plates when it has found a bloodline in the scree, a sound like wet fingers drawn around the rim of a bowl. Every child of the Ridge clans knows it. I told him what was coming, shelled, low, 8 to a pack and patient, hunters of the wounded that take the dragging limb first and wait out the rest. I told him the doctrine for them, which is that there is no doctrine for them. A sound climber outclimbs them to vertical stone. We had a man with 200 extra units of broken climber on his back on flat scree an hour from dark. He set me against a boulder with my back armored by stone, took the longest of the salvaged pitons in his right hand, and put himself between me and the singing, and then he did the thing I have tried hardest in 30 years of telling to make my people believe. He crouched, laid his free hand flat on the scree, closed his eyes and waited, reading them, through the ground, the way they read us. The pack came in as the light went bronze, and they came the way they always come, 2 feints and a take, the take aimed at my splinted leg from my blind side. It never arrived. The human moved once. I have heard 100 cadets ask me to describe the move, and I have failed 100 times. It was less a strike than a correction. As if the world had misplaced a glass hound and he was returning it, and the piton went down through the seam behind the skull plate, the one gap in a glasshound's shell, the gap our own hunters need a pinned and exhausted animal to find. He found it mid-lunge in the dusk. On the first animal of his life, the take beast died at my feet, still singing. The pack song changed pitch. Bafflement has a sound in glasshounds. And the human stood up over the body and did not shout, did not spread his arms as our scare lore prescribes, did nothing at all but stand there breathing slow and look at them. And the pack, which has no lore about Deathworlders, which knows nothing of catalog ratings, which has only the oldest sense of its oldest shell plates, to consult halted that sense and turned and poured itself back into the scree. They tracked us for 2 more days. They never came in again. He cleaned the piton with exactly the strokes he used on his boot knife after meals and looked at the dead glasshound for a moment and said, "Shell's a good splint jacket if we can lift the side plates. Sit tight." And that was the whole of his triumph. Salvage. He armored my splint in the shell of the thing sent to take it, fed the fire that night with glasshound fat that burned steady and low, and went through his pack with both hands, recounting, mouth moving, dividing what remained by 2 lives, and a number of days he kept revising. Downward. I watched him across the fire and asked the question the whole shear had been asking since the staging ledge. "Why did you come down?" He didn't look up from the count. "You were alive." The line was cut. In law, your law's for your people. It balances your books. I can even respect the math. He folded the ration wrap with small exact motions, but I wasn't sworn to it. I was hired to carry weight. He tied off the pack and looked at me then, and there was no fire in his eyes, no anger at my climb master, none of the heat that I, plate-bound and doctrine-fed, would have called conviction. There was just the settled gray calm of a man stating a load rating. "You weigh 210 units, splint included," he said. "I'm rated for more, so your cargo, and cargo gets delivered. Sleep. Tomorrow's longer." The chants of my people have 10,000 verses about love, and every one of them sings it hot. Hearthfire, forge fire, the blood of the rescuing kin. It took an alien to teach me it could be cold and still be the thing itself. He never once said he cared whether I lived. He only kept dividing his rations by 2 and putting his body between mine and my own world, day after day, as if the 2 acts were a single fact too obvious to mention. That night, for the first time since the rope sang through the keeper ring, I did not dream of falling. I dreamed of the weighing scale at the staging camp and the assessor's dry line of trade script and the words I had taken 9 days to begin to translate. Reason. Native. The furnace wind came for us on the 9th day. Every child of the Ridge clans knows its lore. The high ice deserts north of the shear breathe out at the turn of the season, and the breath falls 4,000 meters into the canyon and arrives not cold but burning, compressed by its own descent into a wind that cooks the open ground and strips the water out of anything still foolish enough to be crossing it. The chants give it a verse of its own. The verse is short, because the wind's survivors have always been people who were somewhere else. He knew it was coming before I did. That is the detail I make the cadets sit with. I had the lore, the verse, 22 years of a native's weather sense, and the off-worlder read it first out of the Stillwings, who had been riding our thermals all morning, and who an hour before midday folded out of the sky all at once and went to ground in the lee of the eastern wall like clerks closing a ledger before a fire. "Your birds just quit," he said, stopping. "Scavengers don't quit a wounded thing. What grounds them?" I listened then, truly listened, and found the river of air above the sheer running wrong, high and thin and hurrying, and the verse came up out of my childhood with its teeth showing. I told him what was falling toward us. I told him open ground was death, that the wind would arrive within a chance length, that the lore said dig or die. He did neither. He had seen 200 meters back, a fissure in a fallen slab pile, too shallow, I would have judged, half a body deep, and he made for it at the pace he had shown the flood, and what he did with it I would not have conceived of in a year of dying. He set me into the fissure's deepest lip, wedged the rebuilt pack frame across the opening as a windbreak, and then he skinned the ground tarp off his pack, soaked it with a careful third of our remaining water. I made a sound of protest. He ignored it with the completeness of a man ignoring weather, and rigged the wet cloth across the frame so that the killing wind would have to come through it to reach us. Evaporation buys degrees, he said, working the lashings. Degrees buy hours. Water you can find again. Hours you can't. He wedged himself into the fisher's mouth between me and the rig, the widest body in the worst place, as ever, and the furnace wind arrived. I have no measure for the heat of the next 4 hours, because my people's measures stop where our survivors stop, and we lay the whole time on the far side of that line. The wind came down the canyon with a sound like a forge the size of a country, and the wet tarp hissed and steamed, and he wetted again, twice from the flask by feel, with his eyes shut against air that had begun to burn the seeing surface of them. I drifted. The leg rot fed on the heat, and I drifted, and each time I surfaced, the same flat silhouette was braced across the light, turning itself slowly. Methodically, I understood at last, so that no one side of him faced the burning wind too long, rationing his own hide. Arithmetic again, done in flesh. In the worst hour I asked him, because I believed we had arrived at the appropriate occasion, whether his world had killed him yet, even once, whether anything ever had. Many times he said, eyes still shut, perfectly serious. It just never finished the paperwork. The wind passed at dusk, the way it always passes, all at once, like a debt collector leaving a house with nothing left in it. We had lost a day, a third of our water deliberately and another third to the air, and the skin across his cheekbones had gone the angry color his people's hide turns in place of blistering. He cataloged all of it aloud, flat as a manifest water day skin, and then added, in exactly the same tone, the item that rebuilt me. Cruise intact, net positive. We move at first dark and travel by night until the pans. He had been studying my route maps each evening, and he had found, between us and the throat's approach, the thing the maps drew as a smooth white mercy, the old river's terminal flats, a half-day's crossing of level salt, the only level ground in the sheer. 8 expeditions had blessed it by name. Your maps were drawn from the rim, he said. Flat and white from 4 kilometers up just means undisturbed. Nothing on this world is undisturbed because it's safe. He tapped the white blankness with one torn finger. It's undisturbed because nothing that walks on it twice survives to wear a path. We cross it like it's lying to us. It was lying to us. The pans are a roof, not a floor. A crust of salt and mineral lace laid over the voids the dying river left, in places thick as a hold's wall, in places thin as ceremony, and no eye, native or otherwise, reads which from above. He cut a probe from the longest tent batten before we set out and crossed the whole shining, nightmare of it by feel, half a step at a time, sounding the crust ahead of each boot like a healer sounding a chest. 210 units of me strapped to his back, and the night cold pouring into the canyon around us, and the crust sang back to his probe in pitches even my ears learned to dread, high and true over solid-laid stone, flat, papery, slightly apologetic over the dark. 4 hours in, the lie opened under him anyway. A plate that had sounded true sheared at its far edge, and his leading leg went through the world to the hip. I felt the whole carry rig lurch toward the dark, and I confess what I did, which was nothing, because there was nothing in me to do. And I felt what he did, through the straps with my own plates, and I wanted in the iron precisely. He did not flail. The falling leg's weight was already moving sideways as it fell. He sacrificed it, rode it off mid-fall, and threw everything above it flat across the unbroken crust. The probe slammed crossways like a climber's stake. My weight redistributed along the length of him before the crust's first crack had finished traveling. We lay still, the two of us, spread thin as chantleaf over the hollow dark, his one leg hanging into a void the depth of which neither of us ever learned, salt crystals ticking down into it for a long musical moment like the start of rain. Wait stays long, he said quietly, meaning flat, meaning spread, meaning don't you dare gather yourself to help me. And then I heard it, 4 paces of crust creaking under us above an unmeasured grave, and I will swear it to any moot convened. He laughed, once low, mostly breath. Crevasse rules, he said to himself, in the tone a man uses for an old joke from home. And he swam himself backward out of the world's mouth a centimeter at a time, and found the next true plate with the probe, and stood, and resettled my rig, and went on sounding ahead as if the pans had merely cleared their throat. On the far shore, with stone under us that meant what it said, he allowed us a rest and a quarter ration, and I watched him have his own strip before he handed me mine whole, the way he had been halving his own since the apron, and apparently believed I had not noticed. You feed me past my share, I said. You're healing a leg. I'm just walking. He chewed his half with the unhurried thoroughness he gave everything. Bodies are ledgers. Yours has the bigger debts right now. It was that night, our last on the open floor before the throat's approach, the two of us small and warm beside the blue fire in a country the size of my people's whole story, that I finally asked him the question underneath. All my other questions. not why he had come down. He had answered that with a load rating. I asked him instead about a thing I had been hearing for days without letting myself hear it. You call me Vec, I said. You have, since the apron. And on the wall, before my fall, you knew Sefmadun's name. You corrected your manifests when Koralith and Thesavon traded cash loads. 11 climbers who never once used yours. Why learn ours? He fed the fire a chip of glasshound fat and considered the question with the seriousness he gave Bad Rock. You hire on, you learn the crew, he said. Names are load-bearing. The day something goes wrong on a wall, the difference between, hey, you and a man's name called once, in time, he turned the fat with a piton until it caught, I've watched that. Difference get measured. I helped carry what was left of it down, more than once. He sat back and looked at me across the small blue light, dark eyes level. Your climb master's a sound climber, and he runs a sound rope, and he called you the meat that signs its name, about me, for 40 days, and you all laughed. That's fine, I've been called worse by better. The faintest dry line creased the burned skin at the corner of his eyes. But nobody on that wall fell because of me. Think on the bookkeeping. I thought on the bookkeeping. I have been thinking on it for 30 years. The next morning, the floor began to step down and gather itself. The walls leaned in until the sky was a bright ribbon, and the apron's long country ran out at last against the place all my lore had spent a lifetime dreading. The apron ends in the throat, a slot canyon, the old river's last argument with the stone, 4 kilometers of passage nowhere wider than 3 men, and in places narrow enough that my shoulder plates scraped both walls from the carry rig. It is the only route from the upper fans to the canyon floor that does not require 1,000 meters of technical wall, which is why every expedition map marks it as the descent of last resort, and why 8 expeditions had refused it. The throat does not kill with rock. The throat kills with weather that happens somewhere else. I explained this to the human at its mouth, in the blue shadow of walls that went up out of sight. Rain that falls on the high desert 100 kilometers north arrives in the throat as a wall of water with stone in its teeth, and it arrives without warning under a clear sky on a dry day in the time it takes to sing a short chant. The caste calls the throat's floor the borrowed road. You walk it owing. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, his eyes working the walls while I spoke. Then he asked the question no climber of the caste had thought to ask in 9 generations of dying in that slot. What's the high water mark? I did not know the phrase. He showed me the flood stain, the line of polish and lodged debris the great waters leave on the walls of their passage. Our route maps marked the throat as death and left it at that. He walked into death's front hall, put his hand on the stain, twice his own height above the floor, and started reading the walls the way Thesavon reads chant iron. Every 100 meters he stopped and looked up, not at the sky, at the ledges and chalkstones above the stain. There, he said, and there. See it? Anything above that line has held against every flood since the line was made. He shifted my weight on the rig and rolled his shoulders. We don't outrun water. We don't gamble on weather we can't see. We move ledge to ledge. We're never more than 90 seconds from something above. The stain. Your job is the sky and your ears. Anything changes, pressure, the wind's pitch, that river of air of yours stuttering, you call it, and I climb and you hold on. 90 seconds, I said, carrying me. Up walls with no anchors. That's the rating, he said, and walked us into the throat. It took us 2 days, and the water came on the second. I will set down exactly what I felt and in what order, because this is the part of my testimony the young climbers always stand up to hear. First, nothing. A dry day, a high white sky in the slot above us, the walls breathing their stored cold. Then my ears found it, a wrongness in the river of air, the canyon's breath-checking, hesitating, the way air does when somewhere upstream a great mass has shoved it. I called it, I was not sure. I called it anyway, because he had told me an unsure call was a call, and the human did not ask whether I was sure. He was moving before my sentence ended. The nearest above the stain ledge was back the way we had come, 60 meters, a flake ramp he had marked aloud as we passed it. He had been marking them aloud, I realized later, the entire passage, laying a rosary of refuges through his memory. He covered the 60 meters across flood-polished boulders with 210 units of strapped down climber on his back at a pace my caste does not attain unburdened, and he went up the flake ramp with his hands full of bad holds and his breath, saying, for the first time since the staging ledge, that a price was being paid that could not simply be filed, and we were 9 of his body lengths, up the wall, jammed into a scour hollowed above the stain, when the flood took the throat below us. I had heard the elders describe it. The elders are wrong, it is not a wall of water. It is the canyon changing its mind about being land. The floor we had walked was gone, not flooded, gone, replaced by a moving brown spine of river that carried whole plates of scale rock clashing like cymbals, and the sound was not a roar but a grinding, the sound of the sheer chewing, and the spray that came up at us was cold as the void and smelled of the high desert, of a storm neither of us had ever seen, paying its debt downhill. We sat in the scour hollow for 6 hours while the throat drank its weather. He braced himself across the hollow's mouth the entire time, a flat-faced, gray-jawed lockbar between me and the water, and somewhere in the third hour, over the grinding, he leaned his head back and said conversationally, "Good call." 2 words. I have received the formal honors of 3 clans, and a moot chain with my name etched in iron, and I have never again felt anything the size of those 2 words. It was in the throat, on the dry morning after, that the fever found me. The leg under the glasshound shell had been speaking for a day in a language I had kept private, and that morning it raised its voice. My people run 2 hearts and the infection set them arguing. I remember the walls of the slot bending like heat haze, and my own voice chanting verses out of order, and his hand flat on my throat vessel, counting, the way he had made me count on the first night. He found what he needed in the flood rack, of all places. The storm had torn green ribbonweed from some high oasis 100 kilometers away and hung it dripping on the chalkstones like offerings. My people use ash of it for wound rot. I must have told him so in the fever, in caste dialect, because he boiled it in the peaten cup, made the ash, unsealed the grieve from the wound. I will spare this account that hour, and pack the rot. With the bitter paste, while I called him by my dead father's name, and instructed him, with great dignity I am told, to mind the 3rd anchor, which walks. 2 days I have no claim to, he carried me through both of them. When my mind came back to me, we were out of the throat. I could see open sky, a whole startling lake of it, and I was propped in real shade rigged from his ground tarp, and there was water beside me in the pitten cup, and the human was sitting some meters away in the full hammer of Murr's noon, bareheaded, sorting salvage, with his cracked lips moving over his arithmetic, having given the only shade on the canyon floor to the corpse the doctrine said he was carrying. His own state I noted as a healer notes. The man had crossed the throat twice over in 2 days seeking ribbonweed while I burned. The hands were torn and wept clear fluid at 3 knuckles. The flood spray cold had left a cough living somewhere under his breastbone, and the ribs along his left side. I learned this only much later, at Vethicold from the healer's imaging, because he never once declared it. The ribs along his left side had been cracked since the flake ramp, since the 90 seconds, and he had carried me on them for 2 days regardless, having presumably filed the costs in the place where he filed costs. You should be dead, I told him when I could sit. The throat alone, the noon sun, the load, any of it. He squinted up at the rim of the sheer, 4,000 meters above us, a thin, bright seam of sky. You keep doing that, he said, adding it up by your tables. He tossed me a strip of dried glasshound. He had smoked a supply over the fat fire, I discovered, while I was in the fever, because of course he had, and sat back. First survey team that ever raided your world, what did they land in? Sealed walkers, hard suits? Assessor shells, I said, delaying. The catalog requires, mine landed on my world in canvas boots, he said. There's your difference. It's not that we're stronger. Your caste outpulls me joint for joint, and your hide laughs at rock that opens mine. It's that nothing on my world ever signed a treaty. The weather kills 18 ways. The water kills you if you drink it, and kills you if you're in it. Half the green things are poison, and the other half have thorns, and everything with a mouth has an opinion. He worked a stone out of his boot tread, unhurried. You grow up like that. You stop asking the ground to be fair. You just learn its habits, all of them, every day. He nodded at the shear's far wall, at my whole vertical homeland. This is a hard country, but it's country. It has rules, and it keeps them. Where I'm from, the rules change by afternoon, so. He shrugged, and the shrug had his entire species in it. By my tables, this is a working vacation with bad food. I laughed. It cost me a rib's worth of pain, and I did not care. I lay in the shade of a Deathworlder's tarp on the floor of the wound in the middle of my world, dead-in-law, alive in fact, and laughed until the stillwings circling our camp rose a polite 100 meters, reconsidering. They had been with us since the throat, the stillwings, Murr's patient gray gliders, who follow wounded things with the bookkeeping diligence of clerks and land only when the ledger closes. An escort of them rode our thermals all that day as we started the last distance, and I watched the human watch them, and I watched him understand them without being told, the way he understood everything on my world, not as horror, as information. They're scoring us, he said, deciding when you'll fall over. They have followed every expedition, I said. The chants call them the etchers. They write the wall's accounts. He looked up at the slow circling shapes for a moment longer. Then he adjusted my weight on the rebuilt rig, settled the straps over his cracked ribs without expression, and gave the stillwings, and the shear, and the doctrine, and the whole assembled bookkeeping of my homeworld his answer. Then they can write this down, he said, and started walking. That evening we saw the bones. They lay at the foot of the great wall where the Vethk Stairs fall line meets the canyon floor, in the band of broken ground the chance called the Given Field, and no living climber of my caste had ever seen them, because no expedition descends below its own dead. Climbers, my people, generations of them, wherever the fall line had delivered them across 200 years of doctrine, plate-bound shapes gone to mineral in the dry air, harness iron rusted into the stone, civets still hanging on chest bones, hand spikes scattered like sown seed. The Stillwings had had them, and the glasshounds, and time. Some lay as they had landed. Some, and this is the thing I did not speak aloud for 30 years, and set down now with my hands unsteady. Some did not. Some lay far from any fall line in the lee of boulders in scraped hollows, one with its back against stone and its harness unbuckled, neatly beside it. They had not all died of the fall. Some had lain in the given field as I had lain on the apron, alive, broken, dead-in-law, and listened to the giving fate above them and waited, and no light had ever come down the wall. The human stopped the rig. He stood among my ancestors for a long moment, reading the ground the way he read all ground, and I watched him assemble the same sentence I was assembling, and I watched him decide not to say it to me. That mercy I also note for the record. He said instead quietly, "We'll camp past the far side, not here." But I made him stop at the one with the unbuckled harness, some debts you know on sight. The plate greaves bore the line marks of Kavesh, and the civet on the chest bones was a master's civet, and the harness iron carried the etch of the second expedition 40 years gone. Dren Kavesh's brother, the cut climber our climb master had filed his crest flat for, the man whose giving had been sung when my father was a boy. He had not been taken by the wall at all. He had reached the floor alive. He had unbuckled his harness with care in the order the doctrine prescribes for camp, and set it beside him, and sat down with his back to the stone facing the wall. His clan was climbing a way up, and waited, in the discipline of the caste, for the arithmetic to finish. I sang the giving for him, from the rig broken in dialect, alone, the first giving ever sung at the bottom of the sheer instead of the top. The human stood beside me through every verse with his head slightly bowed, and when it was done he did a thing I had no chant for. He took the master civet from the chest bones, wrapped it in ration cloth, and stowed it in the pack. His people should have it back, he said. And his name was paid up 40 years ago. Somebody should tell them what the bill actually was. We camped beyond the given field, and that night the doctrine and I finished our long argument. I want to be precise, because I have heard this account retold as though an alien shouted my faith out of me, and that is not what happened. He never said one word against the line, not on the whole descent. What happened is quieter and worse. The doctrine says the cut is mercy because no rescue is possible. I had now been the rescue that was not possible. The doctrine says the wall keeps what it is paid. I had watched a man with cracked ribs walk into the wall's own teeth and take its payment back out, twice, on a contract he had already fulfilled. A law that calls itself arithmetic can survive cruelty, but it cannot survive a counterexample. By the fire that night I took my own civet off my chest for the first time since I was 10 years old and turned it over and over in my working hand, and the human watched me do it across the flame and said nothing at all. Because I understood this much later, he knew that some lines a man has to cut for himself. The floor of the sheer is not flat. The maps lie about that as they lie about everything below the haze. The old riverbed steps down in benches, and the last bench before the rec field stood across our path like a fortress course. The brow, 60 meters of flood-polished overhung stone, climbable perhaps by a sound and unburdened master of the caste, not by a burdened man, not by a man whose hands had been weeping at the knuckles for 3 days, whose cough had moved into his breath's foundations, whose ribs I did not yet know about. And the detour around the brow's flank ran 20 kilometers through active glasshound Warren fans, which between his pace and my fever we both knew, without bookkeeping allowed, that we no longer carried the water to survive. He looked at the brow for a long time. Then he unloaded me at its foot, laid out every meter of line we had salvaged, and built, out of my broken cast iron and his own contract hardware, and the physics that his people apparently absorb in childhood the way mine absorbed chance, the thing the young climbers now learn at Vethkhold as the Cade Hall. A counterweight himself. He led the brow free and alone first, 60 meters of overhung polish on ruined hands, and I will not describe that hour except to say that I, a son of the climb caste, watched a wingless mammal from a Class 14 world climb stone my masters would have chanted away from, and that he climbed it not beautifully, not the way the caste climbs, but the way water finds a root, by refusing, with a patience that had something geological in it, to accept that there wasn't one. Twice he came off. Twice the anchors he had placed below him held. Anchors in rock the maps called unanchorable. That judgment, too, the caste has since rewritten, and twice he hung, rested, coughed, spat, and went back up the same way, as if falling were not an omen but merely information about one hold. From the top, he rigged the line over a chalk block, tied himself to one end, and lowered himself off the far side as deadweight while the rig and I rose up the near side, his mass against mine, his body paying out through space to bring mine up. The exact inversion of everything my people believe about the wall, a man making himself the falling weight so that the broken thing could rise. If the moot ever wants a single image for what was done in the shear that month, I have always told them, take that one, cut it in iron. We crested the brow at dusk, and from its top, for the first time, across the last kilometers of wreck-strewn riverbed, we saw it, the carrier of names. She lay on her side against the canyon's far wall where the death of the river had once turned, a hull 300 meters from beak to vents, scale rock drifted against her flanks like snow off a roof. Iron of the old forging does not rust as new iron rusts. She had gone the deep violet black of chant iron, and the last of the day ran along her upper hull in one unbroken line, and I confess, before all the clans, I wept. 3 generations of Vethkari had died between me and that site, 8 expeditions, the given field. My own name was etched on a mourning plate somewhere 4,000 meters above me, and I hung on a Deathworlder's back, dead-in-law, looking at the thing every death had been spent failing to reach. The human looked at her for a respectful while. Then he said, good, hulls intact at the stern, we'll have shade, catchment, and if your people built her the way they build everything else, a transmitter casing strong enough to outlive the operators. He shifted the rig and started down the brow's gentle inner slope, and as he walked he added, in the tone he used for load ratings, the sentence I would repeat to the moot word for word a season later. Your ancestors carried their whole nation's names into the worst hole on a Class 9 world, and the hull still held. Take it from a professional. You come from tough stock, Vec. Somebody just taught you to bury it. We reached her on the morning of the 17th day. I will not stretch this account with the hours it took to find the breach door, nor with what the inner decks held, which belongs to the clan iron and not to outsiders. 2 things only this testimony requires. First, the honor plates it held. The reliquary vaffle stood sealed under 3 generations of drift, and when the human cut the corroded outer latches and set his shoulder against a door built for the push teams of the old forging and walked it open, slowly, his boots sliding, the cough tearing at him, refusing as ever to accept the absence of a root, the lamplight fell on rank upon rank of etched iron, every name since the first 2 climbers roped together, the entire unbroken ledger of who the Vethkari are. He stood aside at the threshold. He did not enter. Family record, he said by way of explanation, as though that were a law of his people, and I suppose it is. Second, the stern transmitter. The casing had held as he predicted, and the mechanism was old-forged and simple, and he sat cross-legged in the stern shadow for a day and a half, with his ruined hands full of green corrosion and small parts, rebuilding by lamplight a device 3 centuries dead of alien manufacture, on a diet of smoked glasshound and seep water, and on the 19th day, the carrier of names spoke for the first time since her fall. He gave the transmitter to me. That also goes in the iron. It was his repair, his right, and he put the speaking iron in my working hand and said, your ship, your names, your call. So it was my voice that rose out of the shear that morning, on the old clan frequency that every hold and ridge station keeps a dead watch on out of pure ceremony, my voice, giving my line and my name, the name of a climber cut and chanted 19 days dead, and stating, in the formal cadence, 3 facts for the moot's iron, that the carrier of names was found, that her plates were whole, and that I lived at the bottom of the shear because a contract carrier from a Class 14 world had come down 4,000 meters after the doctrine had finished with me, against no oath, for no pay, and had carried me through the throat and the fever and the given field and over the brow on cracked ribs without once raising his voice. The frequency was silent for a long moment. Then it erupted, every hold on the continent at once, and somewhere high above us, on the south route, 11 climbers of the 9th expedition heard their dead, calling them by name from the place their doctrine said no voice returns from. The human listened to the uproar for a moment, nodded once as at a job signed off, and went to put water on the fire. They'll come fast now, he said. Moot law or no moot law, nobody alive gets to ignore that transmission. Rest the leg. Company's coming. The 9th expedition came off the Vethic stairs, last pitch 2 days later, 11 climbers moving fast and ragged, and reached the carrier of names in the white blaze of mid-morning to find the dead man chain they had chanted over sitting, propped in the stern shade with his leg in a glasshound shell splint, and the porter they had laughed off, the manifest, crouched at a small blue fire beside him, brewing tea. I want the picture held exactly, because it is the picture the whole moot season turned on, and the young climbers always rush it. He did not stand to meet them. He did not arm himself. The Petons lay sleeved in the pack. 11 climbers of the caste in full plate came across the wreck field at the half-run, 40 days of doctrine and shame and fear arriving all at once, and the Deathworlder looked up from the fire, counted them against the manifest in his memory, and set out on the flat stone he had been using as a board 11 more cups. I have wondered for 30 years how much of what followed was decided by those cups. My people read iron. We also read hospitality. 11 cups, set out without hurry by a man whose hands wept at the knuckles, said in the oldest language on Mur, "I am not your enemy. I am this camp's host." And it said underneath, where only a climber would hear it. And I am not afraid of anything that just came down that wall. Drenkavesh stopped at the edge of the fire circle. The 10 behind him stopped with him. He had run the stairs' last pitches without rest. I knew his gait well enough to read the cost in it, and his eyes went where every caste eye in that circle went first, not to me, not to the human, to the open reliquary door behind us, and the violet-black ranks of the honor plates standing in the recovered dark. 3 generations, 8 expeditions, his own brother's giving. All of it had been spent toward that open door, and it had been opened by a hired alien and a corpse. "Vekaron," he said at last, and his voice was a master's voice still, level as a chant line. "The wall took you. The line was cut clean. I cut it myself. You cut it clean." I agreed. "And the wall had me 18 days, the apron and the throat and the given field. And this man took me back out of its keeping, a meter at a time." I let the silence carry the rest of the arithmetic to 10 exhausted climbers who could each see the splint, the rebuilt rig, the hall rigging still hanging off the brow behind us like a signature. "There is no taking back," Drenkavesh said. "What falls is given. If a thing crawls out of the sheer wearing a cut climber's plates, the doctrine has a name for it, and the name is not Vekaron." He said it heavily, without relish. I record that fairly. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose entire architecture had one keystone, and he could feel it moving. "And the find," he went on, slower now, each word placed like an anchor in bad rock, "falls to the expedition. The carrier and her plates are clan iron, recovered under my leadership, by my route, on my warrant, from the moot. That is how it will be etched." There it was. Not malice, bookkeeping. I was dead, and the dead do not witness. The porter was contract struck, and the struck do not testify. And the door behind us would enter the iron as the 9th expedition's triumph, with the doctrine of the line unscratched, and the given field would keep its secrets. And the unbuckled harness of his own brother would lie where it had lain for 40 years, 3 kilometers from where we stood, unnetched and unexplained forever. The human poured the tea. He did it in the silence after Drenkavesh's claim, unhurried, 11 cups and then 2, and he handed the first cup up to me, to the corpse, host's honor, and took the second himself. And only then, looking at the fire rather than at any of them, he spoke. I set down his words as nearly as I have ever been able to reconstruct them, and the moot has heard me swear to them 3 times. "Before you etch anything," he said, "you should know what's already in the iron. The day before you got here, we rebuilt your ship's transmitter. First send was Vex, his name, the find, the facts. You heard that one. It's why you ran the stair. He blew on the T. Second send went out the same evening on the Moot's record channel, the full log. My contract, the cash manifest, the cut, the date and elevation, the apron, the throat, the route, the timings, my anchor placements on the gray banding. Your route masters will want those. By the way, the maps are wrong about that rock." He said it without a flicker, an engineer filing errata, and the given field, locations of the fallen, all of them, including the one wearing a master's survey of the Kavesh line, 40 meters east of the 3rd boulder row, who reached this floor alive and unbuckled his own harness. The fire circle had gone so quiet I could hear the still wings turn overhead. "The Moots had it all for 2 days," the human said. "Time sealed, witnessed by the relay station clerks at 3 holds. So the only question left this morning is not what will be etched. It's already etched. The only question is what you do in front of 10 climbers who haven't decided yet what they saw on this descent." He looked up from the fire then, finally, and found Drenkavesh's eyes, and his voice did not harden. "That is the thing the cadets can never make themselves believe." It gentled. "Your law cut him because you genuinely couldn't go down after him. I've read it. I believe it. 200 years ago, with your loads and your rope, it was true, and your doctrine was the best truth available." He set his cup down. "It stopped being true the day you could hire me. You knew it at the weighing. It's why the loads were an insult instead of a rating. A man doesn't mock a winch. He mocks a thing that frightens him." Drenkavesh stood with the morning sun full on his flat-filed crest, and I watched 40 years of grief and 200 years of arithmetic fight. For his hands and the grief won. His hand went to his chest and drew the survey. I do not believe to this day that he meant murder. The caste draws the right knife as the moot draws a gavel. It was doctrine reaching for its instrument, a man placing the one anchor he had left. But he came around the fire with the hooked blade in his fist, fast at a hired carrier of a species he had mocked for 40 days, shouting, the only time on the whole account anyone shouted, that the doctrine would not be unmade by meat that signs its name, And 10 climbers of the caste lunged a half-breath too late to stop what every one of them swears. In the iron they then witnessed. The human moved once. I was 4 paces away with a healer's eye view, and I have testified to the moot, under chant, that I can tell them only this. He did not strike Drenkavesh. He received him. A small step inside the arc of the blade, the way he had stepped inside the glasshound's lunge. The wrist met something that was simply already there. The civet continued along its path without its owner's consent and stood quivering, point down, in the flood silt by the fire. And Climb Master Drenkavesh of the 9th Expedition went past his own knife and down onto the ground he had misjudged, with his arm folded behind him at an angle that promised, without delivering, every possible consequence, held, not harmed, by a man who had set his tea down first. The temperature of it. That is what I need the iron to keep. 11 witnesses, and every one of us testifies to the same impossible thing. The Deathworlder pinning a Climb Master of the Vethkari in the wreck shadow of our holiest iron was the calmest object in the canyon. He was not breathing hard. He had not spilled the tea. He held the lock with the same line tension attention he gave a loaded anchor. Exactly enough, indefinitely sustainable, nothing to prove. And he looked down at the man shaking underneath it and said, in trade tongue, quietly, the sentence that the moot voted that winter to etch above the door of the rope school at Vethkold. I came down a mountain for one of yours. Don't make me do anything less polite with the time I've got left here. Then he let him go. He stood up, stepped back, retrieved the civet from the silt, and offered it back to Drenkavesh hilt first across his forearm, the way a chant keeper hands iron. Where had he even seen it? And when the Climb Master would not take it, he laid it gently on the flat stone among the cooling cups. He picked up his own tea. He drank some. Over the rim of the cup he regarded 11 plate-bound climbers of the deadliest caste of a Class 9 world, standing frozen in the morning sun between their doctrine and their eyes. And he gave them the same small nod he had given the staging ledge 40 days and 4,000 meters ago. Tea's getting cold, he said. Then somebody help me build a proper stretcher. Your clansman's been carried by an amateur long enough. He should come home on caste work. And that, I have told this to every cadet class for 30 years, and I tell it to this account now. That was the moment the doctrine of the line actually died. Not at the moot, where they argued it through a whole winter. Not in the iron, where the amendment was finally etched. There, in the wreck shadow, when 10 climbers of the 9th Expedition looked at each other and looked at the corpse drinking tea and looked at the alien asking for help with a stretcher as though the morning had contained nothing remarkable. And then, one by one, in full plate, with their Climb Master kneeling unwatched in the silt beside his own returned blade, they came and picked up the cups. Seth Madoon drank first. He told me, 30 years later, that it was the best tea he has ever had, and that he has never once managed to find the like of it again, and I have never told him that it was ration stock boiled in a pitten cup, because some things deserve to stay iron. The ascent out of the sheer took the 9th Expedition 12 days, and it was, though none of us used the word at the time, the first sanctioned recovery in the history of the Vethkari. 11 climbers and 1 contract carrier bringing a cut man up the wall alive. The caste built the stretcher rig in an afternoon. Caste work as he had asked, double-framed and chant-blessed, and they took turns on the hauls, and the human carried on the pitches where the rock was too rotten for a sworn line to risk doubled weight, which is to say he carried on the worst of them, which is to say nothing had changed and everything had. Drenkavesh climbed last on the rope the whole way up. It is the penitent station. No one assigned it to him. On the 4th day of the ascent, the expedition did the thing I believe the moot weighed more heavily, in the end, than any testimony. They bent the route west at the given field, and stopped, and the chant keeper sang while the caste gathered what 200 years of doctrine had left at the foot of the wall. They could not bring all of them. There were too many, and the wall was still the wall. They brought 11, 1 for each climber's frame, chosen by the marks on the plate greaves where lines still had living kin. Drenkavesh carried his brother. He lashed the frame himself in silence, and he bore it up 4,000 meters of the sheer without once yielding his turn on the hauls. And at the rim, where the holds finally flatten into the high plateau, and the wind comes straight off the ice deserts, and the whole bright country of my people opens north, he set the frame down and knelt beside it, and the man who had cut me from the line wept into the wind, 40 years late, with his filed crest bare to the sky. The human stood apart and let him. Bills paid was all he said to no one in particular. He had a gift for knowing which moments belonged to him, and which did not. That one, for a creature of a world with no treaties, he had the finest borders of any being I have known. The moot sat the whole of that winter on what the iron now calls the Vekaran question, and I will not refight it here. The arguments are etched, and any cadet can read them. The doctrine's defenders were not fools and were not villains, and the oldest of them said the truest hard thing said all winter, that the line had carried the caste across 200 years of a world that forgives nothing and that a law should not be hanged for the crime of having once been necessary. The moot heard him. The moot heard me. I testified from a healer's bench, my leg rebuilt with iron in 3 places, my name struck from the mourning plate by a unanimous chant, the first ungiving ever sung. The moot heard Sefmadun and Thesavant, and last of all it heard the relay clerks read the human's time-sealed log into the record. 4 hours of cash manifests and elevations and anchor placements in dry trade script, and I watched the assembled clans of the Vethkari learn what I had learned on the apron, that there is a kind of love that sounds exactly like arithmetic. The amendment, when it came, was 1 line. My people do not unmake laws. We re-etch them. The doctrine of the line stands in the iron today as it has stood 200 years, with 1 addition cut beneath it in new strokes. The cut is lawful only where no dissent is possible. Let the master who cuts be prepared to show the moot why none was 1 line. It does not abolish the survey. The shear is still the shear, and there are still falls from which no one of any species returns, and the right knives still hang on our chests, honed before every climb. But in 30 years since the re-etching, the blade has been drawn 4 times on the Great Wall, where once it was drawn 4 times a season, because the question is different now. The question on the rope is no longer what is owed. The question is the one the human put to a fire circle of 11 frozen climbers with a teacup in his hand. Not whether the fallen can climb, but how far the living are prepared to go down. It is remarkable, the root masters say, how often a descent becomes possible once the moot expects you to have looked for one. He left at the thaw on the same kind of battered transfer shuttle that had brought him. The clans tried very hard to prevent it in the way of clans. The moot voted him a chain with his name in the iron. He accepted that, gravely, and wore it to the shuttle pad, and I happen to know it hangs now on a wall on his cold blue homeworld between 2 coils of antique hemp rope, because he sent me, years later, an image of it there, with no message attached except the image, which is the most hymn letter I ever received. They offered him land on the rim, a rope school mastership, a tithe share of the carrier's salvage that would have made him wealthy on any world in the catalog. He declined it all with the same flat courtesy and asked instead, payment in full, he called it, for 2 things. The first was the rest of the given field brought home. It took the caste 6 seasons. It is done. There is a new wall of plates at Vethkold, violet black, 3 generations long, and the chant sung at its consecration was written new for the day, and it is the only chant in all our iron that contains a word borrowed from trade tongue, because no Vethkari word existed for what it needed to say. The word is rescue. The elders fought the borrowing bitterly. The elders lost. The second thing he asked for no one but I ever knew about until this account. On his last evening, he climbed up to the healer's terrace where I was learning to walk on the rebuilt leg, and he sat with me while the sun went down the way it does off the high plateau, slow and enormous, and we drank tea that was not ration stock and was somehow not as good, and he took from his jacket the master's survey of the Kavesh line, the one he had carried up from the given field in ration cloth. He had cleaned it and oiled the hinge of its sheath. 40 years at the bottom of the shear, and the blade still held its honed edge. The old forging is the old forging. Drenkavesh wouldn't take it back, he said. Says it belongs to the wall now, and it doesn't belong in my luggage. I'm not caste. He set it on the bench between us. You're going to teach, once that leg remembers its trade. Everyone can see it but you, so you keep it. Show it to the young ones when you tell them all this. He stood and shrugged into his jacket and looked out over the darkening edge of the plateau toward the sheer, where the haze was filling the great wound with evening the way it has every evening for 1,000,000 years, and he said the last thing he ever said to me on my world, the tone he used for load ratings. Tell them the knife isn't the shame. Every world I've ever worked has a knife like that somewhere in its kit, a thing it built for the day when it truly couldn't. The shame is only ever in how early you reach for it, he settled the jacket. Your people stopped reaching early. That makes them, in my professional opinion, better climbers than the ones who hired me. He put out his hand and I took it, my working hand in his ruined one, knuckles long-heeled into a climber's map. Mind the 3rd anchor, Vec, he said gravely. It walks. Then he went down the terrace stairs, unhurried, placing his boots without looking on the only treads that did not creak, and the shuttle took him up over the rim and into the dark, and that was all. He had come to my world as cargo handling, and he left it as 1 line of new strokes in 200-year-old iron, and I genuinely believe that of the 2, he was prouder of the freight manifest being in order. I did teach, 30 years now, ropecraft and routecraft at the school whose door bears his sentence about politeness, which the cadets think is a joke until the year they understand it. I am the master who never again climbed the Great Wall. The leg holds a terrace, not the sheer. and the cadets, who fear me pleasantly, call me behind my hands the master who came back, which is wrong, and which I have stopped correcting because the truth takes a whole evening, and they will each get the whole evening in their turn. Every cadet class, on the night before their line swearing, climbs up to the healer's terrace, and I show them three things. I show them the master's survey of the Kavesh line and tell them about the given field and the unbuckled harness and the bill that was paid up 40 years before it was delivered. I show them my own survey, the one I took off my chest at a fire on the canyon floor and have never worn since, honed, oiled, ready, in its sheath at the bottom of my kit where the doctrine now keeps it, present and last, and I show them the end of a rope. 40 meters of it came up out of the shear with me 30 years ago, the rig line he built the haul from, and at one end of it is the cut, my cut, the clean stroke of a master's blade, the edge of everything my people believed for 200 years. The cadets always go quiet at the cut. They are young. They think it is the relic of a wound. Then I run the line through my hands to the other end, the end that was knotted to the Deathworlder's harness on the brow, and I show them the knot he tied before he hung his own body out over the dark to bring a broken stranger up, still tied, because I have never had the heart to undo it, and never will. One end of every rope is what your people did to you, I tell them. The other end is what someone was willing to do. Climb your whole life, and the wall will ask you, someday, which end you are. Then I send them down to be sworn. And from the terrace, in the dark, I listen to the chant keeper open the oldest verses, the ones about the work of the hands outliving the hands, and I sit with the cut end in my one good fist and the knotted end across my knees, and I find that after 30 years I believe every word of the old chant at last, because I have seen it proved, 4,000 meters down, in the worst hole of a world that forgives nothing, by a small flat-faced creature who is still on cold mornings, the strongest thing I have ever watched move across stone. The work of the hands outlives the hands. His did. It holds my whole nation up. It holds me yet.